Before we go any further into how I walked into that courtroom and the way my own son rolled his eyes while his wife looked down in shame, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If you've ever felt overlooked, like your voice didn't matter, or like your place in the family was shrinking smaller and smaller as the years went on, please hear me now. You are not invisible. You are not finished. These years of your life are not about being pushed aside. They are about living fully, laughing often, and holding on to the dignity and wisdom you've earned. And to help you do just that, I want to share something truly special. 38 uplifting and funny short stories for seniors. Easy-to-read tales that bring laughter, memories, and mental stimulation. Psychotherapist approved. It's a collection of warm, funny, and lighthearted stories written to brighten your day, stir up sweet memories, and give your mind a gentle workout. It's easy to read and perfect for reminding yourself that joy, laughter, and connection belong in every stage of life. So before you hear the truth of what happened when I stopped staying quiet and chose to stand up for myself, and for others, grab your copy from the pinned comment. And if this message touches you, please don't forget to share it with a friend who might need encouragement, and subscribe for more real stories of women who found strength when life tested them. Because what comes next in my story will show you that sometimes the hardest moments with family are the ones that reveal just how strong we really are. My name is Patricia Walker, and I'm 68 years old. For most of my life, I've lived in Ohio. I'm not anyone famous. I'm just a woman who worked hard, raised a son, and tried to do right by people. I never thought I'd find myself walking into a courtroom to stand against my own child. But life has a way of surprising you. That morning, the courthouse was busier than usual. I could feel the weight of people's eyes the moment I opened the heavy doors. Some were there for their own cases, others just curious about the trial everyone in town had been talking about for weeks. At first, I told myself I could handle the stares, but the truth is, I felt every single one of them. My knees were stiff, my heart pounding, but I kept moving forward. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Reporters sat in the back, their notepads ready. Families of tenants who had been hurt by my son's neglect filled the benches, clutching folders and photographs. They weren't strangers to me. I had seen some of them before, in hallways and waiting rooms. They had asked me quietly, sometimes tearfully, "Mrs. Walker, will you help us?" And there, at the defense table, sat my son Albert. My only child. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie too tight around his neck. His face looked hard, sharper than I remembered. The years of money and power had carved something into him that I didn't recognize. The moment his eyes caught mine, he leaned back in his chair and rolled them, as if my presence was nothing more than an annoyance. That little gesture cut me deeper than words could. Beside him sat Tiffany, his wife. She was younger than Albert by a few years, always careful about her appearance. Her hands clutched a leather purse on her lap, and when she saw me, she looked down quickly, as if ashamed. Her eyes didn't lift again. I couldn't tell if it was embarrassment, guilt, or fear, but the silence between us spoke volumes. I walked past them without saying a word and found my seat at the front. That was when I noticed Judge Ramirez at the bench. He had been preparing his notes, but when he looked up and saw me, his pen froze in midair. His eyes widened just slightly, and I knew at once that he remembered me. It had been decades since I'd worked as a paralegal on a case that shook the housing system in this county. Back then, I was younger, sharper, and determined to make sure families had safe roofs over their heads. Judge Ramirez, then just a young attorney, had been on the other side of that case. I remembered the long nights, the endless files, and the satisfaction of seeing tenants win the right to live with dignity. Apparently, so did he. His gaze lingered on me for a long moment, and I heard a faint whisper ripple through the courtroom. Some people recognized the name Walker. A few looked from me to Albert and back again, confused, trying to piece together how the woman from those old stories could possibly be connected to the man sitting at the defense table. The bailiff called the court to order, but the air in the room felt heavy. I sat upright, my back straight despite the ache in my spine, and folded my hands together. I knew why I was there, and I wasn't about to hide from it. You see, I hadn't come to watch. I hadn't come to quietly sit in the back, like some distant relative, wringing my hands. I had come as a witness. Not just any witness, the one person who knew my son's business practices better than anyone else. The one who had seen the complaints brushed aside, the warnings ignored, the money hoarded. I was there to tell the truth. When the judge finally spoke, his voice echoed across the chamber. This court will now hear testimony in the case of the People versus Albert Walker. The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to close my eyes, to imagine this was all a mistake, but I kept them open. I couldn't afford to look away. Not anymore. Albert shifted in his chair. His jaw tightened. His mouth curled in the same way it had when he was a teenager, and I told him he couldn't have something he wanted. It was a look of anger and dismissal. For years, I had told myself he would outgrow it, that he would mature into the kind of man his father had hoped for. But there it was again, plain as day. Tiffany remained silent, her eyes on the table. She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't look at the judge, wouldn't even look at her husband. She seemed small in that moment, as though she wanted to vanish into the wood of the courtroom bench. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. Mrs. Walker, I understand you have chosen to appear before this court. Is that correct? I nodded, my voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. I am here to testify. The words caused a stir. I heard gasps, whispers, even a chair scrape against the floor. People couldn't believe what they had just heard. My own son turned his head sharply, his mouth opening in shock. For the first time since I had walked in, he truly looked at me, not with dismissal, but with something closer to betrayal. In that single instant, I understood that my choice had changed everything. I was no longer just his mother. I was a witness for the truth. The silence in the courtroom grew deeper, thicker, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. I kept my eyes forward, my shoulders firm. I wasn't there for revenge. I wasn't there for glory. I was there because I couldn't look the other way anymore. The families who had suffered deserved to be heard, and if it took my voice to make that happen, then so be it. That was the moment my life and my family split in two. After I walked out of that courtroom on the first day, I sat in my car for a long time. I kept thinking about how we had gotten here. How did the little boy I once tucked into bed at night become the man who rolled his eyes at me in open court? If you don't mind, I'll take you back, because this story isn't just about a courtroom. It's about family sacrifice and the choices we all make. I grew up in Ohio and spent most of my working life as a paralegal. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. I made sure paperwork was right, deadlines were met, and people's cases didn't fall through the cracks. After my husband, Frank, passed away from a heart condition when Albert was only 9, I poured myself into both my job and raising him. It was just the two of us. No brothers, no sisters, no one else to lean on. Every decision I made circled back to Albert. Money was always tight. I remember clipping coupons and making casseroles stretch over 3 nights. My shoes wore thin before his ever did, because I'd patch mine and buy him new ones. I skipped vacations, new clothes, even retirement savings, because college was always the goal. I wanted him to have the kind of life Frank never got to finish. Albert was smart, no question about that. In high school, he could do math in his head faster than I could on a calculator. I remember teachers pulling me aside at parent-teacher conferences, telling me he had potential to go far. Those moments lit me up inside. I'd smile and say, yes, he's going to make something of himself. When he was accepted into Ohio State University, I cried. Not because of the cost, though Lord knows I worried about that every single night, but because I thought we had made it. I worked late hours at the law office. I took extra typing jobs from home. And I even sold Frank's old tools to cover what scholarships didn't. Every penny went to Albert's tuition, his books, his dorm. I told myself the struggle was worth it. College changed him, though. At first, he'd call home often. He'd tell me about his classes, his friends, his professors. But by junior year, the calls slowed down. When I asked why, he'd just say he was busy. When I visited, I noticed little things. He started talking more about money than about people. He wanted the newest phone, the expensive watch, the car he couldn't afford yet. After graduation, Albert decided real estate was the way to get rich fast. He had no interest in practicing law or working steady in an office. He said houses were where the real money was. I didn't argue. I thought maybe he just wanted something different from me. But deep down, I worried. Real estate can be honest work, but it can also chew people up if they're not careful. That was around the time Tiffany came into the picture. Tiffany was polished, always well-dressed, always looking ahead to the next thing. She wasn't unkind to me, but I noticed right away she pushed Albert toward bigger risks. Buy more, she'd say. Expand. Don't waste time with repairs. That's what management companies are for. She wanted status, and Albert wanted to give it to her. Together, they built up a business of rental houses and small apartment buildings. At first, I was proud. Seeing my son own properties felt like success. But pride turned to unease as complaints started to surface. I'd overhear conversations at church about broken furnaces, leaky pipes, and landlords who wouldn't answer calls. My stomach would twist when I realized those landlords were Albert and Tiffany. I tried to talk to him. I remember one Sunday dinner. I made roast chicken and mashed potatoes, just like when he was little. Halfway through the meal, I said gently, Albert, tenants are people. They need safe homes. Please make sure you're keeping up with repairs. He set down his fork and gave me a sharp look. Mom, you don't understand business. These people exaggerate. If I fixed every little thing they complain about, I'd go broke. That cut deep. I had worked my entire life in the legal field watching ordinary folks fight for fair treatment. To hear my own son dismiss their struggles like that, it was like he had turned into someone I didn't know. Still, I kept trying. Whenever I heard about a problem, I'd bring it up. Once, I even offered to pay for a plumber myself. He laughed and told me not to meddle. Tiffany would smile politely, but her eyes said it all. She wanted me out of their business. Over the years, Albert pulled away more and more. Phone calls turned into short texts. Holidays felt strained, as if my presence was a burden. He stopped asking me for advice altogether. It was clear that the only voice he truly listened to was Tiffany's. She encouraged him to buy more, cut corners, and stretch every dollar. Together, they built a little empire, but at the cost of their integrity. And me, I stood by, watching the distance between us grow. I reminded myself that I had given him everything I had. I gave him my time, my energy, my love. I gave him my heart, but he gave his loyalty to money. It wasn't one moment that broke us. It was years of small choices, little dismissals, ignored warnings. By the time tenants began organizing against him, I knew where his path had led. Still, I didn't want to believe it would come to this. I thought maybe he'd change, maybe he'd remember the lessons I tried to teach him. But when I saw him roll his eyes at me in that courtroom, I knew the truth. He hadn't just turned away from me. He had turned away from everything good I tried to put into him. And now I was the one called to stand and speak. Once Albert and Tiffany built up their properties, it didn't take long before complaints started piling up. At first, I heard whispers around town. People at church would mention that the new landlord never answered calls. Others said repairs took months, if they ever happened at all. I kept quiet, hoping it was just exaggeration. But then I started to see the truth with my own eyes. One cold January, a woman from my neighborhood stopped me outside the grocery store. She had 2 little kids bundled in coats that looked too thin for the weather. She recognized me and said, "Mrs. Walker, you're Albert's mother, aren't you?" I nodded, unsure where the conversation was headed. Her voice shook as she explained. Their furnace had broken just before Christmas, and no one had come to fix it. They had been heating the apartment with their oven door cracked open. I froze. Using an oven like that is dangerous, and I knew it. I promised her I'd talk to Albert. That night, I called him. He sighed into the phone. "Mom, you're letting them pull at your heartstrings. Tenants always exaggerate. They want free upgrades." I argued, heat in January isn't an upgrade. It's a necessity. But he brushed me off. "Mom, you don't understand business. If I fix everything, I'll never make a profit." That was his answer for almost every issue. The more time passed, the more I saw an elderly man who had served in Vietnam lived in one of Albert's units. He came to me one afternoon, coughing, with photographs of black mold spreading across his ceiling. His doctor had warned him to move out, but he had nowhere else to go. He begged me to speak to Albert. I went over to the house myself. The smell of dampness hit me the moment I stepped inside. Mold climbed the corners of the bedroom walls. The bathroom ceiling sagged with water damage. I could barely breathe, and I thought of that veteran trying to sleep in such conditions. When I told Albert about it, he waved me off again. "Mom, he's lived there for years. He's used to it." That answer made my stomach turn. I knew the law. Landlords are required to provide safe housing. Mold isn't something you get used to. It can kill. There were families too. A single mother named Carla had 3 children in grade school. She worked double shifts at a diner to keep food on the table. When the pipes burst in her kitchen, she put in maintenance requests over and over. No one came. She told me her kids did their homework at the laundromat because it was the only place with running water. I visited her once. She showed me buckets lined up under the sink to catch leaks. Her youngest, no more than 8, said, "We just wash up at Grandma's." My heart sank. I tried again to reason with Albert. We were sitting in his living room, and Tiffany was there too. I told him about Carla's children. He smirked and said, "Mom, she's behind on rent. Maybe if she paid on time, I'd consider it." I looked at Tiffany, hoping for compassion, but she shrugged. "Business is business," she said quietly. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just neglect. This was a choice. They were choosing profit over people. The complaints grew louder. Tenants began to talk to each other, compare stories, share photographs. Soon, they realized they weren't alone. They started organizing, and I heard they were preparing a lawsuit. Part of me wanted to disappear, to pretend I had no part in it. But another part of me knew the truth. I had seen enough to know my son was guilty of neglect. The day I knew it had gone too far was when I visited a tenant who had been admitted to the hospital. Her name was June. She was 73 and had lived in one of Albert's buildings for over a decade. When I walked into her hospital room, she reached for my hand. Her lungs had been damaged by mold exposure. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "I called your son every week. No one came." I held her hand, and I felt a deep shame wash over me. She wasn't a stranger to me anymore. She was a woman my age, suffering because of the choices my son had made. I went home that night and cried harder than I had in years. I asked myself how the boy I raised could turn into this man. It wasn't long after that when an old friend came knocking. Daniel Hayes, a lawyer I'd known for decades, stopped by. We'd worked together years ago on housing cases. He still had the same steady eyes, the same calm way of speaking. "Patricia," he said, "the tenants are ready to take Albert to court. We need witnesses. You've seen what's happening. You know the law. We need your voice." The words struck me like a blow. To testify against my own son? The thought made my stomach twist. I shook my head. "Daniel, I can't. He's my child." He nodded slowly. "I understand. But these tenants don't have anyone else. They trust you. They believe you can help them." After he left, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen. The clock ticked on the wall, each second louder than the last. My son's face filled my mind, the boy who used to sit at this very table coloring with crayons while I paid bills. But then I saw the faces of the tenants. Children doing homework in laundromats, veterans coughing in mold-filled apartments, elderly women gasping for breath in hospital beds. I was torn in two. My duty as a mother pulled me one way, but my duty as a decent human being pulled me the other. I told myself maybe the lawsuit would settle. Maybe Albert would finally fix things, pay the fines, and move on. Maybe I wouldn't have to get involved. But deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. The tenants needed someone who could stand up and say what they had seen. Someone who knew Albert, not just as a landlord, but as a man. And that someone was me. Still, I couldn't bring myself to agree right away. I prayed about it. I walked the neighborhood at night, weighing the cost. To speak against Albert meant risking whatever little relationship we still had left. It meant breaking the bond of silence most mothers keep for their children. At the same time, staying silent meant betraying the people who had no one else. That was the battle raging inside me as the court date drew near. I didn't know what I would decide, but I knew this much. The truth had a way of finding its way to the surface. And if I wasn't the one to bring it out, someone else eventually would. The moment that pushed me past my hesitation came one spring afternoon. The phone rang, and it was one of the tenants' daughters. Her mother, Mrs. Lewis, had been admitted to the hospital. She begged me to come visit, saying her mother kept asking for me. Mrs. Lewis was 76, a widow who had lived in Albert's building for years. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for her neighbors and watered the flowers outside every morning. When I walked into her hospital room, the sight of her took my breath away. She was thin, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Machines beeped softly beside her bed. She reached out her hand, and I took it. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Patricia," she said, "I called your son for months." The mold spread across my bedroom walls. I couldn't sleep. My chest got worse and worse. I left messages. He never came. The words pierced me. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was simply telling me the truth. I tried to hold myself together, but tears rolled down my cheeks. I sat there for an hour, listening to her cough, remembering how I had once told Albert to check that very apartment. He had waved me off, saying, "It's cosmetic, Mom. A little bleach will fix it." I knew better. Mold like that isn't just an eyesore. It's a health hazard. And now here she was lying in a hospital bed because of his carelessness. When I left the hospital, I sat in my car and sobbed until I could barely breathe. All the excuses I had made for him. He's busy, he'll learn, he'll do better next time, crumbled that day. I realized that by staying silent, I had become part of the problem. That night, I pulled out a box I had kept in my closet. Inside were old notes, letters, and printouts from years past. I had always saved things. Call logs from when tenants left messages at Albert's office, copies of repair requests that were ignored, even text messages where he told me flat out that tenants could wait their turn. I spread them across my dining room table. As I looked at the dates and details, I saw a pattern I couldn't ignore. The stories matched what tenants had told me. Broken furnaces in winter, leaks that never got fixed, mold spreading unchecked. It was all there in black and white. I sat in that kitchen for hours, staring at the evidence. The truth was right in front of me, and I couldn't deny it any longer. The next morning, I called Daniel Hayes, the lawyer who had asked me to testify. My voice shook as I said, "Daniel, I'll do it. I'll tell the court what I know." He didn't sound surprised. "Patricia, I knew you'd come to this decision. It's the hardest choice a mother can make, but it's the right one." After I hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the wall. The weight of what I had agreed to sank in. I was about to stand in open court and speak against my own child. Over the next weeks, I prepared quietly. I went through every note, every letter, every email. I made sure nothing was exaggerated. Everything had to be exact, accurate, and undeniable. If I was going to do this, I had to do it right. I found photographs I had taken years earlier when I visited properties. One showed a ceiling stained with water damage. Another showed a bathroom wall covered in dark spots. I had taken those pictures to show Albert, thinking it would convince him to act. He had brushed them aside. Now, they would speak for themselves. I even found a few conversations I had written down word for word after talking with him. One in particular stood out. It was from a call 2 winters ago, when I told him a tenant's heat had gone out. He said, "Mom, people survived winters before furnaces. They'll be fine with space heaters." I had written the sentence exactly as he said it, because I couldn't believe those words had come from my own son. I gathered everything into a binder. Each page was a reminder of how far he had fallen. Each page was also a reminder of the responsibility I carried. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not neighbors, not friends, not even the tenants. I knew word would spread soon enough, but I wanted the choice to be mine alone until the day I stepped into that courtroom. At night, I lay awake, torn between grief and determination. Memories of Albert as a boy came flooding back. The way he used to run into my arms after school. The drawings he taped to the refrigerator. The nights we stayed up playing board games, laughing until we were both too tired to move. Those memories warred with the image of Mrs. Lewis in the hospital bed, whispering that she had begged him for help. It broke me to admit it, but I couldn't protect him anymore. Shielding him from consequences had only made him bolder, more reckless. The tenants deserved justice, and the only way to give it to them was by telling the truth. I kept hearing Mrs. Lewis's words over and over. "I called your son for months. He never came." That sentence became the turning point in my heart. It was the moment I stopped making excuses and chose to stand on the side of what was right. By the time the court date arrived, I was ready. My binder was organized, my notes clear. I had gone over my testimony a dozen times with Daniel. I knew Albert would hate me for it. I knew Tiffany would look at me with disdain. But I also knew the tenants would finally have someone in their corner who could not be dismissed. It wasn't courage that carried me forward. It was necessity. Because when you see wrong with your own eyes, and when you hear the cries of people who are suffering, silence becomes its own kind of sin. So I chose to speak. Would you have chosen differently? If this moment moved you, please share this video so others can weigh in too. And if you think you would have stayed quiet, tell me in the comments why. Don't just click away without saying something. The morning I took the stand, I felt like every step toward the witness box carried the weight of a lifetime. I clutched my binder of notes. the one I had worked on night after night at my kitchen table. When the bailiff swore me in, my hand trembled slightly, but my voice was steady. I promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Judge Ramirez gave me a small nod, almost like an old friend acknowledging another. Mrs. Walker, he said, please proceed when you're ready. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the courtroom. The jury stared at me, pens in hand. The tenants sat in the front row, watching closely. I could see Albert at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his face turning red. Tiffany sat beside him, her head lowered, eyes fixed on the table. The prosecutor, a woman named Karen, began gently. Mrs. Walker, can you tell the court your relationship to the defendant? I swallowed hard. Albert Walker is my son, my only child. That sentence drew whispers from the crowd. The jurors glanced at each other. They knew the weight of what was about to follow. Karen asked, and what was your profession before retirement? I worked as a paralegal for nearly 35 years. Most of that time was in housing law. I helped prepare cases where tenants fought for safe conditions. The judge leaned forward slightly, as though confirming what he remembered. I could see recognition in his eyes. Karen continued, Mrs. Walker, did you have conversations with your son regarding his properties and the complaints made by tenants? I opened the binder, turned to a page, and nodded. Yes, many times. I warned him about issues that could harm people. I read from my notes. On January 5th, 2 winters ago, I told Albert that a tenant's furnace had broken. His exact words to me were, Mom, people survived winters before furnaces. They'll be fine with space heaters. The courtroom stirred. I kept going. When I told him about mold in a veteran's apartment, he said, he's lived there for years. He's used to it. When I asked him to help a single mother with broken pipes, he said, if she paid her rent on time, maybe I'd consider it. Albert shifted in his seat, whispering angrily to his lawyer. The jury, though, leaned closer, their pens scratching across paper. Karen asked, do you have any written proof of these conversations? I held up printed pages of text messages. Yes, these are from Albert to me. She handed them to the judge and jury. I watched their eyes scan the words. One message from Albert read, Mom, stop worrying. Tenants exaggerate everything. It's not worth the cost. Another, if they don't like it, they can move. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to continue. I saved these messages because I hoped one day I could show him how serious this was. I never imagined I'd be showing them in court. Karen nodded, then asked softly, Mrs. Walker, how did it feel to hear your son dismiss these issues when you knew the tenants were suffering? I paused. My voice was calm, but my heart ached. It felt like I had failed. I raised him to be kind, to be responsible, to value people over money. But every time he brushed me off, I realized he had chosen profit over compassion. I loved my son, but I loved the truth more. The courtroom was silent after that. Even the judge seemed to stop writing. Karen gave me a moment, then asked, Mrs. Walker, why did you decide to testify today? I looked toward the tenants sitting in the front row. Their faces were tired, worn down by years of being ignored. Then I turned back to the jury, because people deserve safe homes, because children shouldn't be doing homework in laundromats, because veterans shouldn't be sleeping in mold, because women like Mrs. Lewis shouldn't be lying in hospital beds after begging for help, and because silence would make me just as guilty as my son. One juror wiped at her eye. Another shook his head in disbelief. As I continued, I laid out photographs I had taken. This is a ceiling from one of Albert's properties, stained with water damage. I held up another. This is mold covering a bathroom wall. I explained the dates, the addresses, the times I had brought them to Albert's attention. Karen asked one final question. Mrs. Walker, in your view, did the defendant knowingly neglect his tenants? My voice didn't waver. Yes, he knew, and he chose not to act. I closed the binder and sat back. For a moment, the room was quiet, as though everyone was letting the words sink in. Albert glared at me, his face twisted with anger. He leaned close to his lawyer, speaking rapidly, but I could see it in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to go this far. Tiffany stayed frozen, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. She didn't look at me once. Judge Ramirez cleared his throat. Thank you, Mrs. Walker. Your testimony is noted. His voice carried a tone of respect I hadn't heard in years. As I stepped down from the stand, I felt both heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier because I had just put my son's future in jeopardy. Lighter because for the first time in years, I had spoken the truth without holding back. When I returned to my seat, I kept my eyes forward. I didn't look at Albert, though I could feel his glare burning into me. I didn't look at Tiffany either. I thought of all the tenants instead, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my words had given them a chance at justice. Inside, my heart broke. I wanted to protect my son, but I also wanted to protect the people he had harmed. I chose the latter, and as much as it hurt, I knew I had done the right thing. That day in court, I stopped being just Albert's mother. I became the voice that the tenants had been waiting for. And though my son might never forgive me, I prayed that one day he would understand why I did it. After my testimony, Albert's lawyers moved quickly. They knew the damage had been done, and their only chance was to make me look unreliable. The next morning, they called me back to the stand. One of them, a sharp man in his 40s with slicked back hair, leaned against the podium. His tone was polite, but I could feel the edge behind every word. Mrs. Walker, he began, you're 68 years old, correct? Yes, I answered. And you've been retired for some time now. That's correct. He nodded, pacing a little. Would you agree that memory fades with age? That sometimes details from years ago can get mixed up? I looked him in the eye. I would agree that happens to some people, but I spent 35 years as a paralegal. My job was to keep details straight, even small ones. I still keep records, and I brought them with me. I opened my binder again, sliding forward documents with dates, tenant names, and Albert's own words. These are not memories I pieced together. They're notes, photographs, and written messages. I didn't rely on memory. I relied on facts. The lawyer frowned, flipping through the pages. He tried again. Mrs. Walker, isn't it true that as a mother, your emotions could color your recollection? That perhaps you're exaggerating to punish your son? My chest tightened, but I kept my voice calm. I didn't come here to punish anyone. I came here because I couldn't ignore what I saw. These tenants didn't deserve to live in unsafe conditions. That's not exaggeration, it's reality. The jury watched me closely. Some nodded as I spoke. I could feel their sympathy shifting further away from Albert's table. The lawyer pressed harder. Isn't it possible, Mrs. Walker, that you're misremembering conversations with your son? I shook my head. No, and let me explain why. I wrote those conversations down when they happened. That's what I did as a paralegal. I knew the importance of accuracy. I have dates, times, and direct quotes. If I wasn't sure, I wouldn't have brought them here today. Judge Ramirez leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Counselor, unless you have evidence that contradicts the witness's notes, this line of questioning is wasting time. The lawyer stepped back, clearly frustrated. I sat quietly, my hands folded, but inside I felt steady. They had tried to shake me, but I wasn't rattled. Then came the moment no one expected. The prosecution called Tiffany to the stand. I watched her rise slowly, clutching her purse as if it were a shield. She avoided my eyes, avoided Albert's too, and walked to the witness chair. She looked nervous, her fingers twisting together. The prosecutor asked, "Mrs. Walker, did you ever discuss tenant complaints with your husband?" Tiffany hesitated. She glanced at Albert, whose face was stone. Then she looked down at her hands. "Yes," she whispered. The prosecutor leaned closer. "Can you tell the court what you said?" Tiffany's voice shook. I told him not to waste money on repairs right away. I said to delay them until we had more cash flow. I thought it would help us financially." The courtroom gasped. Even the jury shifted in their seats. The silence that followed was heavy. I felt my heart drop. Hearing it out loud from her own mouth confirmed everything I had feared. My son hadn't just ignored repairs on his own. He had been encouraged to delay them, to treat tenants' health as less important than profit. The prosecutor pressed. "So you admit that you urged Albert to delay repairs, even when tenants were living without heat, with leaks, with mold?" Tiffany swallowed hard. "Yes." Albert's face turned red. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, his hands gripping the table, so tightly his knuckles turned white. For me, it was a strange mix of sorrow and vindication. Sorrow that Tiffany, a woman I once hoped would be a partner to my son in building a good life, had pushed him deeper into greed. Vindication that the truth was finally in the open. Judge Ramirez looked directly at Tiffany. His voice was stern. "Mrs. Walker, do you understand the seriousness of your admission? People were harmed by these choices." She nodded weakly, tears forming in her eyes. When Tiffany stepped down, she walked past Albert without looking at him. He didn't glance at her either. The space between them felt wider than the courtroom itself. As I sat there, I thought about how far things had fallen apart. This wasn't just about missed repairs anymore. It was about a pattern of choices, a marriage built on ambition, and a son who had lost his way. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no joy in seeing Albert squirm or Tiffany break down. Instead, there was a deep ache in my chest. This was my family unraveling in front of the entire community. But there was also relief. For years, I had carried the weight of knowing what was happening. Now, it wasn't just me saying it. The truth was out, spoken clearly and under oath. When the judge finally called a recess, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Tenants hugged each other, their faces a mix of shock and hope. I stayed seated, staring at the wood grain of the table in front of me. My son's defense had crumbled piece by piece, and nothing I did could put it back together. Still, I reminded myself why I was there. Not to destroy him, but to stand for the people he had hurt. And as painful as it was, I knew I had chosen the only path left to me, the path of truth. Do you think truth is worth this kind of pain? Hit the like button if you do. The final day of the trial came sooner than I expected. After weeks of testimony, photographs, medical records, and inspections laid bare, the jury was sent to deliberate. The tenants sat together in a quiet row, holding their breath. Albert sat at the defense table, his jaw locked, arms crossed, as if willing the jury to see things his way. Tiffany stayed beside him, pale and withdrawn, barely speaking. When the jury filed back into the room, I felt my chest tighten, my hands clasped together, so firmly that my knuckles ached. Judge Ramirez called for order, and the foreman stood. The words that followed seemed to hang in the air, each one heavy as stone. On the charge of willful neglect of tenants resulting in harm, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted with gasps and murmurs. Some tenants wept openly, others nodded, finally seeing their struggle acknowledged. Albert's face drained of color. He turned toward me for just a second, and in his eyes I saw not anger, not arrogance, but something new, fear. Judge Ramirez lifted his gavel. Order in the court. We will proceed. His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise. He turned his gaze to Albert. Mr. Walker, this community trusted you with homes, and you turned them into places of danger. Greed blinded you to your duty. People suffered, children suffered, while you counted your profits. The law does not tolerate such neglect. Albert lowered his eyes to the table. Tiffany wiped at her face, her shoulders trembling. The judge continued, his tone steady but firm. This court is not just about contracts and money. It is about lives. Every landlord has a duty to provide safe, livable housing. You failed. And in failing, you harmed this entire community. The sentence will reflect that failure. I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief that my son was hearing these words. Relief that the people he had wronged were finally seeing justice. Then, something happened that I wasn't prepared for. The prosecutor stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, before sentencing, the state requests that the court hear a statement from the person most deeply affected by the defendant's actions, his mother. My heart stopped. The room went still. Judge Ramirez turned toward me. His voice softened. Mrs. Walker, if you wish to speak, you may. Every eye in that courtroom turned in my direction. The weight of it pressed down on me. I hadn't expected this moment, though perhaps I should have. Slowly, I rose from my seat. My knees wobbled, but I made my way back to the witness stand. When I looked over, Albert was staring at me. For the first time in months, maybe years, his expression wasn't smug. It wasn't cold. It was uncertain, almost pleading. He knew I had the power to sway the judge. I could ask for mercy. I could remind the court that he was my son. Inside me, the struggle was fierce. I am a mother before I am anything else. Every instinct screamed at me to protect him, to shield him from harm. But another voice whispered louder. The voice of Mrs. Lewis in the hospital bed. The voice of Carla's children doing homework in laundromats. The voice of veterans coughing in moldy apartments. I drew a breath, steadying myself. Then I spoke. Your Honor, I said, my voice clear in the silence, my son did not just neglect his tenants. He neglected every value I ever taught him. I raised him to be honest, to be compassionate, to respect people. But he turned away from all of it. He chose money over decency, and people suffered for it. That is something no mother can excuse. Albert's eyes widened. I saw the flicker of fear there, the realization that I would not save him. I went on. If I stood here today and asked for leniency, I would be betraying the very people he harmed. I would be betraying myself. He has earned no mercy from this court. I ask you to impose the maximum sentence. The words left my mouth like stones dropped into deep water. The room held its breath. For a long moment, no one moved. Judge Ramirez nodded solemnly. Thank you, Mrs. Walker. Your statement will be taken into account. I stepped down, my legs trembling. My body felt weak, but my resolve was firm. I returned to my seat, my hands shaking as I folded them in my lap. The judge lifted his gavel again. His voice was final. Albert Walker, this court sentences you to the maximum penalty under the law. 5 years in state prison, restitution to your tenants, and permanent suspension from property ownership in this county. Gasps filled the room again, followed by quiet sobs of relief from the tenants. One man whispered, Thank God! Albert slumped back in his chair, his face pale, his shoulders heavy. Tiffany sat frozen, her hand covering her mouth. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at me either. As the bailiff approached Albert, I felt my heart crack in two. Watching your own child led away in handcuffs is a pain I would never wish on anyone. But beneath the grief, I felt something else, resolve, because I knew in my heart that I had chosen truth over silence. The courtroom slowly emptied, the sound of footsteps echoing off the walls. I remained seated for a long time, staring at the wooden table before me. My hands trembled, but I kept them folded. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, I loved my son, but I loved the truth more. And in that moment, I understood that love isn't always about protection. Sometimes it's about letting someone face the consequences of their choices. When I finally stood to leave, the weight of the courtroom seemed to lift, but the ache in my heart remained. I walked out knowing life would never be the same. I had asked for the maximum sentence, and the judge had given it. If you believe I did the right thing, subscribe and share this story. If you think I was wrong to ask for the maximum sentence, write it below. Don't just watch quietly, make your voice heard. The courthouse emptied that afternoon, but the story didn't end when the gavel fell. By evening, the local news stations were already reporting on the trial. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, as the television played in the background. Albert Walker, a local landlord, was sentenced today to the maximum penalty for tenant neglect, the anchor said. The case gained attention not only for the conditions tenants endured, but also because key testimony came from his own mother, Patricia Walker, a retired paralegal known in the community for her work in housing law. The words made my stomach twist. They called me courageous. They said I stood up for what was right. But inside, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a mother who had just watched her only son led away in handcuffs. The phone started ringing not long after. Friends, neighbors, even people I hadn't heard from in years called to say they were proud of me. Some left messages. Patricia, you did the right thing. Patricia, you gave a voice to people who didn't have one. Their words were kind, but I struggled to accept them. Doing the right thing had come at the highest cost. 2 days later, I went to the grocery store. As I walked down the aisle, a man approached me. I recognized him, one of Albert's tenants, a veteran who had lived for years with mold on his walls. He held out his hand. Mrs. Walker, he said, his voice rough with emotion, you gave us dignity. No one listened before, but you did. I'll never forget it. I shook his hand, my throat tight. I'm so sorry you had to live like that. I wish I could have done more, sooner. He shook his head firmly. You did enough. You made sure we were heard. Encounters like that became common. At church, women hugged me, whispering that they admired my strength. At the pharmacy, someone patted my arm and said, you spoke for all of us. The praise poured in, but it didn't erase the ache inside me. I wanted justice for the tenants, yes, but I never wanted humiliation for Albert. Seeing his name splashed across headlines hurt more than I expected. Reporters used words like greedy landlord and heartless slumlord. Every time I read those words, I winced. That was still my son they were talking about. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd sit by the window and wonder where it all went wrong. I thought about the little boy Albert once was, about the sacrifices I had made, about the choices he later made on his own. Justice had been served, but it didn't heal the wound of losing him. Then there was Tiffany. She didn't come to see me after the sentencing. She stayed silent, slipping out of the courthouse quickly that day. A week later, I heard through a neighbor that she had filed for separation. She couldn't handle the scandal, the press, the shame. When I received the news, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity for a woman who had chased after money and ended up losing her marriage, her comfort, her sense of security. I never hated Tiffany. I just wish she had been strong enough to steer Albert toward decency instead of away from it. One evening, as I left church, I saw her sitting alone in her car in the parking lot. For a moment, our eyes met. She looked tired, her face drawn. She gave a small nod, almost an apology, before starting her car and driving away. I stood there in the fading light, feeling only sadness for her. Meanwhile, the tenants began to rebuild their lives. With the restitution the court ordered, some finally repaired their homes. Others moved to safer places. A few came to see me personally, bringing small gifts, a loaf of bread, a thank you card, even flowers from a garden. They weren't grand gestures, but they carried more weight than I can describe. Each one reminded me that my choice had mattered. Still, the attention wore on me. Reporters knocked on my door more than once. They wanted sound bites, headlines, a mother against son angle to print in bold letters. I turned them away. I didn't want to be the face of a scandal. I wanted to live quietly, like I always had. But no matter how much I tried to fade back into normal life, the community wouldn't let me forget. At the library, at the bank, at the post office, people stopped me to say, "Thank you for standing up." And each time, I nodded politely, but inside I thought, would you still thank me if it were your son sitting in that cell? Because that was the part no one saw. They saw courage. I felt heartbreak. They saw justice. I felt loss. They saw strength. I felt weakness late at night, staring at the empty chair across the table. And yet, even through the grief, I knew I had done what needed to be done. The law had spoken, the tenants had been heard, and Albert had been held accountable. Nothing could change the fact that people had suffered under his choices, and nothing could change that I had been the one to speak up. One Sunday after service, the veteran came up to me again. He handed me a folded note. Inside it read, "You may have lost a son, but you gained the respect of a community." I folded it carefully and tucked it into my Bible, because while the loss was heavy, the truth was heavier still, and I had carried it. That was the aftermath. A town that saw me as courageous, tenants who finally felt heard, and a son who sat behind bars. A family fractured, but a community healed. And I caught between the two, learning to live with both sorrow and pride in the same breath. After the trial, life slowed down, but the silence in my house grew heavier. I had spent months preparing evidence, meeting with lawyers, and sitting in courtrooms. Suddenly, it was over. Albert was behind bars, Tiffany had filed for separation, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I tried calling Albert once after the sentencing. I thought maybe he would want to hear my voice, even if it was only to argue. The phone rang, and when he finally answered, there was no warmth in his tone. "What do you want, Mom?" he said flatly. I took a deep breath. "Albert, I just wanted to check on you, to let you know I still care." He cut me off. "Care? You put me in prison. You destroyed my life. Don't ever call again." The line went dead. I sat there with the receiver in my hand, my chest aching. I had expected anger, but hearing it directly left me shaken. 4 days after, I replayed that moment in my head. Every word, every sharp edge in his voice. The loneliness hit hardest at night. I'd sit at my kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Albert once did his homework. Memories crowded in. The laughter, the birthday candles, the smell of his favorite dinners. I wondered if I would ever see him smile at me again. But slowly, I found pieces of comfort. Church friends began inviting me to coffee after services. Neighbors stopped by just to sit with me for a while. Even some of the tenants I had helped came back to thank me again. They didn't talk about the trial. They just asked how I was doing. One Sunday after service, Mrs. Lewis's daughter hugged me tightly. "My mom's breathing is better now that she's out of that apartment," she said. She talks about you all the time. You gave her hope. I realized then that while I had lost Albert's trust, I had gained something else, a sense of community I hadn't felt in years. People who once barely knew my name now looked at me as someone they could rely on. Still, I needed something more than sympathy. I needed purpose. I had spent decades working in housing law, and that knowledge couldn't just sit in a binder gathering dust. So I began offering small workshops at the senior center. At first, it was just a few people, older neighbors who wanted to understand their rights as renters. We'd gather in a side room with a chalkboard, and I'd explain things simply: what landlords were required to fix, how to document complaints, where to go if no one would listen. They asked questions, shared their own stories, and left with information they could actually use. Word spread. Soon, the room filled up each week. Some came with notepads, others just to listen. I never charged a dime. Teaching gave me something to wake up for, something to remind me that my knowledge still mattered. One afternoon, after a session, an older man pulled me aside. I didn't know we had the right to withhold rent if the furnace isn't fixed, he said. My landlord ignored me for months. Now I can stand up for myself. I nodded, feeling a quiet pride. For so long, I had questioned if speaking against my son was worth it. But moments like that reminded me I won't pretend it was easy. Some nights, the ache of missing Albert was unbearable. I wrote letters to him, though I never knew if he'd read them. In each one, I told him I loved him, that I prayed for him, that I hoped prison would give him time to think. He never responded, but I kept writing anyway, because no matter what he believed, I hadn't stopped being his mother. In my quiet moments, I reflected on the cost. I had lost the closeness of the only child I had. I had lost the idea of family dinners, of holidays shared, of watching him grow old with me. But I had also gained something else: respect for myself. I had faced the hardest choice of my life, and I had chosen truth. I may have lost a son's love, but I gained something just as valuable: self-respect and truth. And at my age, that matters. I wanted to leave this world knowing I had done what was right, not what was easy. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it. I always pause before answering, because regret is complicated. Do I regret that Albert went to prison? Of course. Do I regret that he hates me now? Every single day. But do I regret speaking the truth? No, because silence would have been a heavier burden to carry. At church one Sunday, a friend leaned over and whispered, "You've inspired us, Patricia. You showed us that doing what's right is worth the cost." I smiled faintly, though my heart still ached. I hadn't set out to inspire anyone. I had only tried to live with myself. And that's where I stand now, living with the cost, but also with the knowledge that I chose the path I could walk with my head held high. Months passed after the trial, and life settled into a quieter rhythm. The headlines faded. The reporters moved on to other stories, and the courthouse that once buzzed with whispers about my family went back to its ordinary business. But for me, nothing felt ordinary anymore. I had adjusted to the silence in my house. I had adjusted to the absence of phone calls from Albert. I kept teaching my small classes at the senior center, meeting friends for coffee, and filling my evenings with reading or sewing. Life kept going, as life always does. Then one morning, I went to the mailbox and saw an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was familiar, neat, rounded, almost careful. I carried it inside, sat at my table, and opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from Tiffany. Her words were shaky at first, as if she had struggled to begin. "Patricia," she wrote, "I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up long before the trial. I saw what Albert was doing, and instead of stopping him, I encouraged it. I thought we were building a future, but all we built was a house of cards. I know my silence made things worse, and I am sorry. I paused, letting the words sink in. For years, Tiffany had seemed polished, untouchable, focused only on appearances. Reading her letter, I saw something different, a woman who was finally admitting her part in it all. She went on. I'm trying to rebuild my life now. It's not easy. The separation was painful, but I couldn't live under the weight of what we had done. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day we can sit down and talk. At the bottom of the letter, folded carefully, was a small photograph. It was a school picture of my grandchildren, two bright faces smiling awkwardly for the camera, their hair neatly combed, their eyes full of the same spark I once saw in Albert when he was their age. The moment I saw that picture, tears filled my eyes. My hands trembled as I traced their faces with my finger. It felt like a quiet bridge across the divide Albert had built between us. I may have lost his closeness, but I hadn't lost everything. Through those children, a piece of him and a piece of me lived on. I held the photo to my chest and whispered a prayer of thanks. That night, I placed the picture in a frame on my nightstand. Each morning, I looked at it before I started the day. It reminded me that even in broken families, there are still threads that tie us together. I thought of Albert often, wondering if prison was softening his heart or hardening it further. I wondered if he had seen the children's photos that year, or if Tiffany had kept them from him. I wondered if he hated me with the same sharpness as the day he hung up on me, or if time was beginning to dull the edges of his anger. I may never know, but one thought kept me steady. Maybe one day Albert will understand that telling the truth was my last act of love. Maybe one day he'll see that I didn't stand against him. I stood for what was right for the people he had hurt and for the values I raised him to hold. Until that day comes, I will hold on to this picture of my grandchildren and the hope that love finds its way back. I've shared my story with you, not because it's easy to relive, but because it's real. Because many of you listening may know what it feels like to be torn between love for family and doing what's right. It's a choice no parent ever wants to make, but sometimes life places us there anyway. So let me ask you, would you have testified against your own child if justice demanded it? Do you believe silence is loyalty, or is truth the higher love? I'd like to know what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done in my shoes. And before you go, please remember to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach more people, and it means more than I can say. This was my story, raw, painful, but honest, and I leave you with this. Truth may cost us dearly, but it also